Hello everyone, welcome to today's video. In this video we will be talking about the next block which is used to handle which is used in exception handling in Java, that is the finally block. So up till now we have already discussed what an exception is and what do we mean by exception handling, and as well as we also discussed about how we can handle the exceptions in brief. That means we can handle exception using the try, catch block, as well as finally then throw and throwable, throws and throwable. So we will be talking about them one by one, and in today's discussion we will primarily be talking about the finally block, and we also checked about the difference in errors and exceptions. So basically, when we were talking about the first way in order to handle exception, we saw that with a small example where we wrote the risky code under the try block. So the syntax of try block is something like this. So we wrote the risky code using the try block, and within the catch block what we wrote was the error handling or the exception handling code. Okay, so exception handling code basically is an alternate code which is used whenever there is an exception in that particular method. Okay, so let us see this once again, recapitulate this. So suppose I have a program with the name class ABC, and within here I have the main method which is public static void main, and then string arguments, and then let me write down the first block which is the try block, and within here I am supposed to write the risky code, and then we will be having the catch block where it will be considering the class of exception along with the reference variable. Okay, so class of exception and the reference variable, and within this we will have the alternate code. Okay, so in my previous example we talked about the arithmetic exception, which is divide by 0. So I have a is equal to 50, b is equal to c, and c b is equal to 0 and c will equal to be a by b, and I am trying to print here the value of c. So system.out.println, and here I am trying to print the value of c. So in this particular program what happens is, at this point an exception occurs which we need to handle. So this exception would be the class of exception, since we can anticipate this. So this will be an arithmetic exception. We write this together. So arithmetic exception, so this will be the class of exception, and as already mentioned we can write simply exception here as well, because if we do not have any idea of the exception that it is going to throw, because exception is the primary or the parent class of all exceptions. Now what happens is, whenever an exception occurs at this point, so let me write it down. So whenever an exception occurs at this point, the method under which this exception has occurred, it will create an exception object with three different parameters. The first one would be the exception name. Okay, so this is the exception name. The second one would be the description of the exception, and the third would be the stack trace. As already mentioned, stack trace is basically the line in which the exception would be occurring. Now in order to print this exception, or in order to print the different exceptions which are there in the program, we can adopt three different ways. Okay, so the first way in how we can print this particular exception is by making use of e dot print stack trace. So this is a very widely and commonly used method which is used to print all of these parameters. That means it will be printing the exception name, then the description, as well as the stack trace. So this is one way in which I'll just drop and write it. Okay, stack trace. So all of them would be printed if we are making use of this method. Okay, now this we can simply write it without making use of any system.out.println statement. Okay, stack trace. So if we are simply writing this statement, what happens is this object, okay, which is created by the main method, this will be, the value of this will be printed here. So in this case we will get the name of the exception, which is arithmetic exception, and we will also get the description here, which is divide by 0, as well as the stack trace, that means in which line the exception is occurring. The next way in which we can print the exception is by making use of the system.out.println, and within this we will use e, okay, or system.out.println, we can use e dot to string. So this is also a method which is used to print the object or print the exception. However, in this we will be printing only the exception name and the exception description, but the line number is not printed here. So the difference between this and 1 and 2 is only that the last one, which is the line in which the exception is occurring, is not getting printed in the second scenario. And the third way in which we can print is by making use of, again, system.out.println, but a different method as parameter, which is get message. So here we will be able to access, or the program will print only the exception name. Other parameters such as your exception description, as well as exception the line in which the exception has occurred, this will not be printed. Okay, so this is how we can actually print the various exceptions. We have to understand that this particular statement, or this print stack trace method, this is one of the most widely and popularly used way in which we can print the exceptions. Okay, so these are some of the concepts which are related to printing the exceptions whenever an exception is occurring in a particular program under any method. Now, talking about the next topic of discussion, which is the finally block. Okay, so finally block. So when we are talking about finally block, we have to understand that this block will always execute irrespective of whether an exception is handled or not. So this will always execute irrespective of the exception being handled or not, being handled or not. That means whether we have an exception handling code in the program or not, the block which is described, or the block which is under this finally block, this will always get executed. Okay, so if we talk about the syntax, okay, let us first talk about the syntax. Like in try catch block, finally we'll also follow a particular syntax. So as in try catch block, we saw that we will write the try block followed by the catch block, because try and catch, they both have to work together, and After that, whenever we want to associate this finally block, okay, the finally has to follow the catch block. So this is one way in which we can write it. Let me just reduce this size so that it fits in properly. So try block is here, then we have catch block, and finally we will have the finally block. Okay, so this is one way in which we can. So here we will be handling the exceptions, exception E. So here try basically will be having the risky code. Here we will have the alternate code, and finally we will have certain cleanup code inside finally. So we will talk about this. The next way is if we are using the finally block immediately after the try block. This can also be one of the possible scenarios. Now if we are considering two different scenarios, the first one, if exception occurs. So if exception occurs, then what happens? Suppose there is some exception inside the try block, then it will move to the catch block. After the code is exception is handled, it will finally transfer the control to the finally block. Okay, now if the exception, what will happen if the exception does not occur? So the next scenario is if exception does not occur. So here what happens, the exception is encountered here, but in this second scenario we do not have any exception. So under this situation, this block will not get executed. After the try block is executed, immediately it will move to the finally block. The control of the program will go to the finally block. Similarly, here also, if there is no exception, it will move to the finally block. However, if there is some exception here, then the program will terminate abnormally. Okay, within this, because we do not have any catch block here, the program will definitely terminate abnormally, but it will have the finally code or finally block code executed. So even after this, after the exception is encountered here, okay, at this point the control will come to finally, okay, and the program will abnormally stop. Okay, so whatever it is, first the finally block will be executed, and only then the program will have an abnormal termination. Now if we are trying to use simply finally, okay, if we are trying to use simply finally and then we are trying to write the block of code, this will not be a correct representation, or this will not be a correct combination. There are several combinations in which try, catch and finally could be used in order to execute a program. So we will see them in our uh, later videos. So as of now, we have to remember that try and finally, try, catch, block and finally, they always occur together, and generally whatever be the scenario, whether there is an exception or there is not an exception, the finally block has to execute before the program gets terminated abnormally. So these are some of the things which are related to the syntax. Now let us see a particular program for this. So suppose I have the previous program like class ABC, and here I have the main method, which is public static void main string arguments, and within this let us write down try and the same program. Okay, so int a is equal to 50, b is equal to 0, and c will be a by b, and I'm trying to print system.out.println c. So this is the line where the exception is occurring. So now if I am using the catch block, so let me write down the catch block here. So catch arithmetic exception e, and here I am writing, let's say system.out.println, and I'm trying to print this. Okay, now where do I associate finally? I will associate finally here. So finally, what, let me write down system.out.println, this is the end of the program. So this is the end of the program. So what happens is, I'll close the bracket here. Okay, so here what happens, is the exception is occurring here. Okay, so whenever I'm compiling this program will compile fine, and it will print the exception, and then in the last line it will print the statement which is under the print statement which is under the system, under the finally block. Now what if I am not considering this block at all? If I am not considering this block at all and the exception has occurred, if there is no exception, then it will print fine. Okay, suppose if I'm considering here as, instead of 0 in b, I'm considering here as, let's say, 2. So 50 divided by 2, the output will be 25, and it will also print this is the end of the program, right, if there is no exception. However, now if I'm introducing some exception to it, which is divide by 0 exception, and I'm not having this catch block, what will be the output which I will get? The output which I will get is basically, first the control will be transferred to the finally block. Okay, after the exception is occurred, and it will first print that this is the end of the program, followed by the exception error showing that exception, it will give you the exception, or it will give you the exception object. Okay, details. So this is how the this is how the flow of the program basically occurs. Okay, as already mentioned, we have whatever we have inside the try catch block. Okay, so they are basically the risky code and the exception handling code. Like here we have already said, this is the risky code and the exception handling code. However, in the finally block, what we will have is basically the cleanup code. So let me write it down here. So inside the try block, we basically have the risky code. That means the code which might have certain exceptions. And then inside the catch block, what we will have is handling code, or the alternate code, handling code. Okay, and in the finally block, what we will have is the cleanup code. Now this is basically the use of the finally block. So this cleanup code basically pertains to any such type of codes which is used to close the resources. Now for example, I have a file which is opened. Okay, so that file needs to be closed in this particular point. Similarly, if let's say I have a database connection, so that database connection needs to be closed. Or let's say I have some resources which needs to be released, all those resources would be released in this particular block. So if suppose we will see this, why this is happening. We can simply, if we are opening a file here, we can simply close the file here itself in the try block only, right? But instead of doing this, why do we have to use a cleanup code inside the finally block so that the file is closed, or so that the database connection is closed? Why is it so that we have to write it inside the finally block? So whenever we are considering, let's say, a file program, so what happens is, initially I will open the file, then perform certain file operations. All this type of examples we will do some after some time. So file operations, which is either read or write, and then what we will do, if we close the file here, let's say I'll close the file here. Okay, now talking about the catch block, catch will already be handling the exception E. So here we'll have the handling code, and let's say I do not close the connection in this point. I'll just simply write something else. Okay, and I'll simply write something else. Now what happens is, whenever I'm trying to open the file, let's say the file does not exist in that particular location, what happens? An exception will occur here, right? An exception will occur at this point. So whenever this exception is occurring at this point, the lines which are below this exception will not get executed. This we have already talked about in our very introductory video on exceptions. So the lines below the exception, or the segments below the exception, will not be executed, and this particular control would simply be transferred to the exception handling code, or if in absence of exception handling code, it will directly go to the finally block after it is going for an abnormal termination. So what does it mean? It means that if I'm trying to close the file in the try block itself where the exception might occur, chances are there that file might never be closed, or a database connection which we are trying to open will never get closed, and the program will go for an abnormal termination. So we do not want this situation to occur, and hence we have to mention the closing of the file within the finally block. So if any exception occurs while reading or writing the file, then the code will not execute and the resource will also not close. Okay, so this we have to remember it. Now let us see this through a program. Okay, so if I'm trying to write a program for this, let's say I'll use different color only. Okay, so if I'm trying to write this program, so class A, B, C. Okay, so here we have written public static void main string arguments and throws exception. So this throws keyword we will be talking about after some time, okay, in our subsequent video. So throws exception. So here what we will do is, let me first declare a file input stream f is equal to null. So file programs also we will be doing it. So as of now we do not have to worry much. We simply have to look at the syntax, how these things work, right? So inside the try block, what I'll do is I will write down f is equal to, so the object creation as well as the location, we are pointing it in this particular location. So let's say D, and then we have test.txt. So let's say test.txt does not exist. Okay, so in that scenario, if there is an exception, so we will handle the exception. So let us simply write down the exception class, which is file not found exception. As already mentioned, you can simply write exception also, it will not be wrong, but it is always recommended that we mention the class also. So here what I'll do is system.out.println file not there, or file does not exist, it's up to you. So here what happened is I opened the file here, okay, and now I have to close it. So what I'll do is I'll finally do the cleanup here. So finally, inside the finally block, what I'll try to do is if f is not equal to null, sorry, if f is not equal to null, what will happen, we will simply close this f dot close. Okay, sorry, f dot close. Yes, so this is how we will be cleaning up the code, and we can simply write system.out.println file is closed. Okay, so and then we'll close this blocks. Finally we will close this blocks. Now what happens is we have written our risky code here, and we have also considered the alternate code or the handling code, and if there is any exception, we have also written down that handling code for the exception, and we have also written down the cleanup code for the same cleanup code, right? So if there is any exception, it will come directly to the exception class, and it will get a catch block, and it will print it, and after that it will also close this particular connection. Now if we are talking about this cleanup code, or if you're talking about the try block, we have to understand a few points which is associated with the finally block. So the first point that we have to understand is that we can use multiple catch blocks. Okay, we can use multiple catch blocks. That means there might be n number of exceptions which might occur. Okay, so if we have such n number of exceptions which might occur in a program, we have to use multiple catch blocks with just one single try block. Okay, and we can use only a single finally block with one try block and not multiple. So with one try block and one finally block. Okay, that means what we are trying to understand is that one try block can have multiple catch blocks and just one single finally block. We cannot have multiple finally blocks with one single try block. Okay, and the statements present in the finally block executes even if the try block contains control statements, that is jump statements like return, break, or continue. Okay, suppose the next important point we have to remember is that in case of condition statements, in case of jump statements, right? So if there are jump statements, within the try block, then also the finally block will execute. Finally block executes before the control is transferred. Before control is transferred. So what we mean by this is that suppose within my try block I have some jump statement, okay, like let's say return. So before we we can go to this particular statement, before we go to that particular location in which the control has been transferred, the finally block will first execute. So the control will come to the finally block, and this finally block will execute first, and then only this particular location would be the control will move that to that particular location, right? And after that what we have is the certain possibilities or conditions which will disturb the execution of finally block. Okay, so there are certain conditions in which the finally block might not be executed. So conditions, these conditions where the finally block does not get executed. So there are three different cases. Okay, we will take them up one by one. The first one is that if there is any error. Okay, no, first let us consider the method. Okay, so first one, let us consider the method that if we are using system dot exit method. Okay, system dot exit method. So if we are using this particular method, then this finally block would never get executed. So it will simply execute, or it will simply get exited from the main program. That means the JVM would be externally forcefully stopped, and it will come out of that particular block, and the finally block will not be executed. So this is the first condition under which conditions that finally does not execute. So these are just some of the conditions which shows an abnormal behavior of the finally block. So first one, if we are using system dot exit method, then the second one is if there is a fatal error. Okay, if there is a fatal error, that means let us say there are some memory issues or resources issues which are there, that means some system related issues are there. So if there is an error, then also it will cause the process to abort, and the finally block might not get executed. And the third one is due to an exception arising in the finally block. So if we have due to an exception arising in the finally block. So what happens is, if there is an exception inside the finally block and that exception has not been handled, okay, so at that point of time also the finally block will be aborted. I mean the finally block will not get executed. So simply it is not always mandatory that we have to handle the exception which occurs in the try block. We should also be handling the exception which occurs in the finally block, and if such kind of scenario does not exist, it will lead to an abnormal halt of the finally block. Okay, and the fourth possible scenario is if there is a death of a thread. The thread concept, we will be talking more into it when we will be doing multi-threading, but you have to understand that if there is a death of a thread, that means a death of a parallel process which is going on, so then also the finally block will not get executed. So these are some of the conditions in which the finally block does not execute. So in this session we talked about the different methods of printing the exceptions. Yes, so we talked about different methods of printing the exceptions, and we saw that we had print stack trace as the most commonly used method because it displays everything of the exception object. We also talked about the finally block and discussed about the syntax of the finally block and understood the flow of the finally block with a program. And we also understood that why the finally block is used. The finally block basically is used in order to execute or write down the cleanup code. Cleanup code basically pertains to the closing of different resources or closing of different database connections, etc. Similar types of codes are declared in the finally block. And we also saw why it is actually, why those resource closing or file closing statements are not inside the try block and what will happen if they are inside the try block. And this is one program in which we saw how the risky code is being handled in the catch block as well as in the cleanup code. And there we also talked about certain points which are related to the finally block along with the try catch block. The different combinations of try catch finally we will be discussing in our future videos. So here we have discussed that we can use multiple catch blocks within one try block but one single finally block only with one try block. And also we have discussed that whenever we have a jump statement within the try block, then the finally block executes before the control is transferred to the jump statement location. And finally we discussed about how the finally block does not execute or why there is an abort of the finally block during the execution of a program. So we discussed 4 cases when we are using system.exit method, or if there is a fatal error in the form of system resources, and if there is an exception which might be arising in the finally block, or there is a death of thread. So this is all for today's video. We will be talking about more of exception handling in my next video. Thank you.